your British themed dinner and your lung-free haggis. Okay, the haggis was Texan haggis. And you should all have, if you've requested it, some Scotch whisky for the toast that'll be coming at the end of my short speech here, and the toast of the lads and the lasses. If you don't have whisky, I hope you have something you like. Each year, as those of you who've been here for a few years know, each year I choose a theme, mostly to make myself think of some new jokes. And this year's theme is Scottish independence. You know? I chose it. I chose it because it's topical, just as it was at the time of Burns. There's going to be a referendum in 2014 on whether Scotland should become no longer part of the United Kingdom. In the next year, kilts will be lifted in insult and exasperation. Arguments of economics and emotion echo across the needle exchanges of central Scotland. It's going to be a spectacular, it's a really good Scottish junkie fight. There's going to be some incoherent ranting, some ineffectual blows swinging, ending with both sides soiling themselves, unconscious in piles of their own vomit. So, that's why I did this after dinner tonight. A bit like Congress. Yeah, it's true. Sorry, Senator, staff member. Independence is a hot issue in a cold country. It's so hot that it even managed to burn its way across the North Atlantic into the Washington Post opinion pages in October. The Post suggested that independence could weaken NATO, and it was based on some false assumptions and shaky economic premises. Affronted, Alex Salmond, First Minister of Scotland, struck back in December in the Post to say that if Scotland becomes independent, there will be rivers of chocolate, rainbows in the sky, and children dancing merrily. Actually, I got told. I didn't read it. I just got told about it. Independence, or the lack of it, was a much more complicated, messy, and potentially violent issue at the time of Robert Burns. In 1707, the Union of Parliaments took place, and Scotland and England became one sovereign state. Well, there wasn't exactly the hordes of political pollsters at the time to survey the populace. Most sources suggest it was pretty unpopular with the Scottish population. But the country had been bankrupted by some dodgy foreign expansion plans in Panama, and the people in charge of money decided it was a better idea to have a union. And half a century later, Burns was born, but it had not been a peaceful half century. There had been Jacobite risings in 1715 and 1745. And for those who don't know, the Jacobites were the supporters of the descendants of James II. He was a Catholic king who'd been unceremoniously kicked off the British throne in 1688 and replaced with the soundly Protestant, if awfully Dutch, William of Orange. And while these weren't really battles for independence, they have been characterised through history then and now, often as Scotland versus England. So, taking advantage of the Catholic Highlands, the Jacobites came through Britain via Scotland, picked up Highlanders on the way, and many Scots died for the political ambitions of royal wannabes like Bonnie Prince Charlie, who to my mind always looks like a bit of a pre-op transsexual in his tight skirt and bad French accent. So, on January 25th, 1759, on an evening with weather probably quite similar to ours, Burns was born into poverty. Under the damp clay skies of the southwest of Scotland, he toiled in the mud and ice and grew mostly weeds. Not wheat, which is modern Scotland. In the 18th century Scottish climate, 50 Shades of Grey would have had a completely different and less sexy. The memory of the last Jacobite uprising was as recent as our memories of Clinton's sex scandals, if a lot less entertaining. But just like Clinton, Burns did his best to keep things sexy. He spent every spring sowing his seed, and if he wasn't very successful as a farmer, he had a far greater harvest in terms of illegitimate children. The wombs of maids made more fecund soil than the harsh climate of Scotland, and are a lot more fun to plough. Sorry. My wife told me that one wasn't acceptable, so I kept it in there. I gave her a wee private show last night and read the speech. So low. Nice to see you. If the environment was poor in terms of money and materials, it was rich in the sense of a loss of better history. Many of Burns' forefathers were Jacobites, and that influences world view. And he often wrote poetry in sympathy with the Jacobites. Here's one poem, There'll Never Be Peace Till Jamie Comes Home. And Jamie is the son of the aforementioned James II. So let me just take a wee bit of water and I'll read to you all. Excuse me. By yon castle wall, at the close of day, I heard a man sing, though his hair it was grey. And as he was singing, the tears doon came. There'll never be peace till Jamie comes home. My 7 braw sons for Jamie drew sword, but now I greet round their green beds in the yard. It break the sweet heart of my faithful and dame. There'll never be peace till Jamie comes home. Now life is a burden that bows me down. Sin I tint my bairns, he tint his crown. But till my last moments, my words are the same. There'll never be peace till Jamie comes home. The Jacobite... Oh, thank you. The Jacobite risings had a strong sectarian element, but it's mostly absent in Scotland today, except in football matches between Rangers and Celtic in Glasgow. Burns was...
What Rangers?
yeah. We're still going to fight with our Hibs and Hearts, yeah. Just not Dunfermline Athletic, my home team of crapness. Burns was more interested in the wine than the wafer. His support for the Jacobites was divorced from religion and closer to the sentiments that variously inspired the American and French revolutions, both of which he supported. And I'm going to read a few lines from his Ode to General Washington, which I always feel is appropriate in Washington, D.C. And just to help interpret it a wee bit, the first line refers to Alfred the Great, a 9th century Anglo-Saxon king who had stood against foreign tyrants, the Vikings. Burns invokes Alfred to say that England, which once stood against tyrants, has become a tyrant herself. Alfred, on thy starry throne, surrounded by the tuneful choir, the bards that erst have struck the patriot lyre, and roused the freeborn Britain's soul of fire. No more thy England own. Dare injured nations form the great design to make detested tyrants bleed. Thy England execrates the glorious deed. Beneath their hostile banners waving, every pang of honour braving, England in thunder calls, the tyrant's cause is mine. The next piece of the poem is about Caledonia, an ancient name for Scotland, and ends with a reference to William Wallace, the 13th century Scottish hero who fought against and defeated the English and was immortalised in Braveheart by a diminutive alcoholic Australian. I could go on. Thee, Caledonia, thy wild heaths among, famed for the martial deed, the heaven-taught song, to thee I turn with swimming eyes. Where is that soul of freedom fled, and mingled with the mighty dead, beneath that hallowed turf where Wallace lies? It's not actually a very good poem if you read the whole thing. The content of the poem is virulently anti-English and bemoans Scotland's lack of guts, far more than it actually celebrates George Washington. It's pretty clear, Burns, he wanted independence from England, but unlike Washington or the Jacobites, he wasn't about to take up arms. He suffered from revolution envy. Even if he'd had the inclination, he didn't have time to be a revolutionary. When he wasn't impregnating his mother's servant, Burns' life was a hard one. He was a farmer and later a tacksman who worked excruciatingly hard for a risible salary. Then out of the blue, he suddenly experienced tremendous success and fame for his poetry. In 1787, aged 28, he published a popular volume of poetry and was whipped off to Edinburgh to hang out with aristocrats, men of letters, the wealthy, more maids than he could possibly get pregnant. And except for the maids, most of the people he'd always held in great disdain. Needless to say, he enjoyed every second of that year. It was an appealing life, but no one really made much of a living from poetry ever, really. You think of Lord Byron and Alfred Lord Tennyson, and something's telling me they had an alternative source of income. But Burns unfortunately did not, so it was back to the soil and the toil. Burns sympathised with revolutionaries and independence, but more profoundly throughout his life, he had a sympathy for the downtrodden that went beyond politics and nationality. His empathy reached all of those with a hard life, toiling and enslaved by circumstance. He famously wrote about a mouse whose home he'd accidentally destroyed, and to a mouse and turning up in her nest with the plough in 1784. And if I have a wee bit more drink, here are a few lines of it. We sleek at cour and timorous beastie, oh what panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start away sae hasty, with bickering brattle. I would be loath to run and chase thee with murdering prattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies the ill opinion which makes thee startle, and me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. And he wrote in sympathy with the slaves being transported to the Americas in the Slave's Lament of 1792. And here's the first verse of the song. I'm obviously not going to sing it. 'Twas in sweet Senegal that my foes did me enthrall, for the lands of Virginia, Virginia, oh. Torn from that lovely shore, and must never see it more, and alas, I am weary, weary, oh. Torn from that lovely shore, and must never see it more, and alas, I am weary, weary, oh. Of course, in one of those ironies that separate the idea from the real, such sympathies didn't stop Burns from trying to get work on a slave plantation in Jamaica. But like most of Scotland's unilateral attempts at empire building, he was unsuccessful. Maybe Burns escaped being labelled as one of history's hypocrites by his crap performance at job interviews. But he's a poet, who's asking him to be rational anyway? Burns' life was poetry, brief fame, Burns' life was poverty, brief fame, poverty and early death. He died from a bad experience with a dentist, aged 37. Yeah, I nearly died when I saw the invoice from my dentist, aged 35. But those are 21st century problems. Today, we talk about the people left behind by globalisation. Well, Burns was an 18th century equivalent, one of the people of the British Isles left behind by the Union. A poor farmer who struggled to get work, and yet who was inspired to write brilliant human and earthy poetry. He wasn't educated at Cambridge like Wordsworth or Byron. He's of the Shakespeare mould of like, how does someone with so little education write that? Except no one has felt the need to create any cheeky conspiracy theories that attribute his poetry to some knight of the realm, unlike Shakespeare. Burns didn't benefit from the union with England like his contemporaries. James Watt, born in 1736, who played a key part in the Industrial Revolution and whose name is emblazoned in virtually every electronic appliance you own. He didn't benefit from empire through business like Sir William Fettes, born in 1750, who left behind a fortune for the school that educated Tony Blair. And he certainly didn't benefit from free tuition fees in Cambridge like I did. In the 19th century, Scotland's union with England created unprecedented opportunity for the Scottish people. It continued to do so well into the 20th century, and in my experience personally, it certainly did so to this day. Burns wanted independence for Scotland, and he didn't get it. So far, he's been on the wrong side of history. Who knows what will happen next year, 2014. But for his dedication to the insulted and the injured, for his poetry celebrating the dignity of man, his verse that rejoices in the nobility of failure as much as the pleasures of success, he was on the right side of humanity. So, nationalism, it causes a lot of disagreement and ill feeling between Scots. So I thought I'd end the little speech here on something almost all Scots agree on, a poem about the joy of whiskey, Scotch whiskey. So this is an excerpt from Scotch Drink from 1785. Oh whiskey, soul of plays and pranks, accept a bardie's grateful thanks. When wanting thee, what tuneless cranks are my poor verses. Thou comes the rattle in the ranks of others as. Thee Ferrin Tosh who sadly lost, Scotland lament frae coast to coast. The colic grips and barking host may kill us all. For loyal Forbes chartered boast is ta'en awa. They cursed horse leeches of the excise, who make the whisky stills their prize. Hold up thy hand, devil, hands twice, thrice there, seize the blinkers, and bake them up in Brunston pies for poor damned drinkers. Fortune, if thou but gie me still, hail breeks of scone and whisky gill, and routh the rhyme to rave it well, take all the rest, and dealt about as thy blind skill directs thee best. Ladies and gentlemen, let us raise our toast to the immortal, or at least 254-year-old memory of Robert Burns. Thank you.